All right. Hello, everybody. I am making what is probably my last pre-recorded lecture of this term. And it's kind of about what you're going to be doing in your last phase of your group project, but also just kind of on this big question of what it means to be actually planning to carry out a research project. As I've said, we don't carry out a research project in this class. What we do is plan. And then when you guys go on to take your third year methods course, whether it's qual or quant, you'll actually get the experience of putting together a plan and carrying out the project. So it's a slightly different game. But for right now, what we're going to do is talk about what are the things you have to take into account and what are the things you have to do to be ready to carry out a research project, because it varies a lot. And that's important. So let me share my PowerPoint. Okay, I'm not even going to bother to go whole screen here. I'm just going to leave it like this. So when you get to the point where you're planning a research project, there's a lot going on, right? You always start with trying to figure out what other people have said on the topic, what matters, what's really important, what you agree with, what you disagree with, what are established methods used to investigate things, all of that stuff, right? Like that's your whole start of the process. And then you get to the point where you're developing a clear research question, right? Something you can actually go out and investigate. And then the next step is that you've got to have a plan. So the key thing, right, is you can't start a research project without some kind of plan, right? It is possible that if you just kind of like wander out and see what you find, you might end up with something interesting, right? But first of all, what distinguishes research from other kinds of learning about the world is usually that we have a structure and a plan, and that we've strategically based what we're going to do on what's previously known, right? And the other thing that that you need, the reason why you need a plan is because you might get lost, right? And the chances of getting lost are actually pretty high. There are all sorts of things that can happen during the research process, right? Things can be disrupted, right? You can not get the data you thought you were going to get. You can find that the conclusions are totally different than what you thought they would be. You can end up with like all sorts of crazy things happening when you're trying to conduct research, right? And so if you don't have a plan, the odds that something's going to come and screw up what you're trying to do are high. So that's what you've got to have a plan for. But so everybody agrees you need a plan, right? The problem is the type of plan you need and the parts of the plan you need are going to be different based on what kind of project you're doing, right? Everybody needs a map, but not every map needs to include the same steps, and not every map is to the same place, right? This is another part of research, that the project you come up with is going to be different. So everybody needs a plan, but everybody's plan is different. Okay. And I'm going to take this brief lecture, right, to reflect on 5 things that influence your plan: your paradigm, the logic of your question, whether or not you're working with human subjects, what type of data you're collecting, and miscellaneous, right? And the miscellaneous one we pay the least attention to in kind of formal methods training, but it's also very important. So I'm not going to dwell on the miscellaneous, but I often find that people have questions related to that miscellaneous category. It's a different critter though. Okay. So these are some of the big things. Let's start with paradigm. Let's go back to all our old conversations about paradigms, right? And in this case, the distinction here matters less as to whether you're a realist or interpretivist or positivist. It really matters. Are you a positivist or a post-positivist or non-positivist, right? Because the logic of positivism, right? Validity in a positivist framework rests on following a precise and specific method, right? If your method is insufficiently specified, or if your process is murky or unclear, right? And particularly if you haven't laid out the major parts of it in advance, right? A positivist worries about the validity of your claims. You need to start the process if you're proceeding as a positive. Be very clear about what evidence looks like for you. What is evidence of the effect you're looking to understand, right? You've got to have that laid out in advance. Non-positivists, right, recognize the inherent instability of those kinds of foundations, right? The fact they kind of work from a presumption that you can't control for all the randomness that's going to occur. Okay. Positivists are also like, there's a lot of randomness that's going to occur. So we need to make sure that our structure will hold up against the randomness, right? We need to make sure that we have a plan and a structure such that the randomness doesn't break what we're doing. Non-positivists say a lot of randomness is going to happen. We need to be able to follow as the randomness redirects us, right? So this is the difference between someone throws a ball at me and I'm going to catch it and not let it get past my hand. And someone throws a ball at me and I'm going to turn that into a movement and use the momentum to do something else, right? I don't know, the part of me that lived with a dancer for a really long time is thinking about how movement is passed around in dance, but that's a metaphor that's probably not worth developing at this moment, right? But this is the idea, right? Random stuff is going to come hurling at you and it's going to shift what you're doing, right? Post-positivists go like, yeah, so how are you going to respond to it, right? Positivists are concerned about how you're going to withstand it. The story I tell all my graduate students, right? So if you ever become my graduate student, you'll hear the story again, right? Is that I walked into my dissertation proposal defense saying that the themes I was going to investigate in Arab community organizing were democracy promotion, US foreign policy, and gender relations, specifically feminist movements. And about 2 months in, I called my dissertation supervisor and said, cool, so I'm abandoning that framework. And the new framework is community educational practices, Palestine activism, and everyday contestation over gender. And she was like, yep, that makes sense, because nobody in the room was a positivist and was like, but you are deviating from your previous. No, it's fine that I was deviating because we were all prepared to work in a research agenda like that. And I didn't have to redevelop anything, right? On the other hand, I have friends who do statistical analysis and kind of like complicated analytic work, right, involving statistical modeling. And their model has to be perfectly ready to go before when they were kind of at the point where they needed to launch their dissertation, right? So they took long time to write their dissertation proposal. And then they were able to finish their PhD in 6 months after that, right? Because the document they had was basically a cool, I've done this. Once you sign off on this, I can press the button and hit go, right? It's a totally different approach to research because of the way that your presuppositions establish what you need to do, right? And those people produced cool research, and people who proceed like I do create cool research, right? It's really just about what our core assumptions are and how that sets you up to carry out a project, right? The next thing is a logic, right? I need to draw the Venn diagram that is the relationship between positivism, between paradigm, logic, and data type. Because there's like one of those, some of these things overlap frequently, but not always. And anyway, I need to write that up, right? So if you're doing something deductive, right? You can't do a project without a clear hypothesis, a clear operationalization of all the variables, and a clear sense of how you're going to get data that will allow you to answer that hypothesis, right? What does this mean? It means that if you don't know how to specify the effect you're looking for, right? And how to be extremely clear about what the null hypothesis looks like empirically, right? Then you're not actually going to be able to test your theory. You need to be able to say, okay, if these two variables have an effect, if this variable has an effect on this variable, right, I will get this circumstance. Therefore, I'm going to go out and look for values of this variable, values of this variable, and see what the effect is, right? That's it. You've got to do that, right? And then you have to be very clear on how will you know? How will you get from the state of the world to this is an example of this version of the variable, right? If you don't have that, you can't proceed forward, right? So you've got to have all of that sort of stuff in process. Someone's going to get the door, right? Someone heard the doorbell? Let's hope so. Okay, if you're conducting an inductive project, right? Then different question, right? You need to be really clear about the type of information you're going to be collecting, but you don't have a hypothesis at the beginning, right? Again, this is about theory generation, not theory testing, right? So you have to know what you're going to be finding and how you're going to be sorting it so you can get to that clear hypothesis at the end, right? Because what you're doing is producing a theory, right, that will in the future produce a testable hypothesis, but you've got to get there. So what you have to do is be super, super clear about kind of the ideas you're looking for and what they look like. Again, this is about operationalization, right? How you take the messy of this in the world and you convert it into something that looks like a variable, right? And something that you can kind of be confident in your measurement of. So that's the inductive process. And remember that deduction and induction are symbiotically have a symbiotic relationship, right? They move back and forth between each other. Lastly, if you're working abductively, right, then you have to have enough knowledge to be able to really feel grounded and comfortable with the material you're going to be working with, right? But you don't have a clear hypothesis. You don't have clear operationalizations to begin with. You don't have a kind of laid out plan for how you're going to do it. What you need is a plan to chart where you're going, right? You don't know what your next steps are going to be when you're proceeding abductively, because what you're trying to do is make sense of this whole thing, which means you need to follow the pieces of the thing as it goes where it goes, right? So what your plan needs to be able to do is record all of those subsequent steps you took, right? Like that's the process you need to be paying attention to. And, you know, by the end of the project, you'll have gotten somewhere and you need to be able to tell people how you got there, right? You don't need to know at the beginning of the project where you're going to end up, because that's not going to be the most useful thing you can do. So you just got to know that you can follow your logic and not have to recreate it like hypothetically, right? Just that you know how you got there. So the next thing, this is stricter, right? If your project involves any interaction with human beings, you must go through the research ethics board. Yes, even if the risks to those human beings is little to no risk. I know some of you were confused about this. You're like, how can answering a survey harm anybody? It is unlikely to. There are ways in which a survey could harm people, right? If you ask people harmful questions on the survey, or if you ask them questions about illegal activity and then turn over your data to the police, right? Like that's a form of harm from a survey. But even if you're asking questions that are not problematic in a way that is not problematic and protecting people's data in ways that are appropriate, you're still asking people of questions, right? So therefore, you've got to go through the process, even if there's little to no risk. Even if you outsource your data collection, right? Let's say you pay somebody to conduct person on the street interviews or carry out a survey or, okay, so this is the difference, right? You obtain from a political party video recordings of their nomination meetings versus you go to the political party and ask them if you can or if someone can record and give it to you, right? If the party already has this thing, it's theirs and they have the right to do with it as they feel, as they please, and you get permission to give it to you, or they broadcast it on television, or they live stream it on Facebook and you record it in that way. Technically, you're not interacting with anybody, you're just recording. Once you've asked if you can record the data, once you're going to have to record the data or like interact with people to get that data, then it's human subjects research, right? This is a bright line. If you're interacting with people at all, you must go through the process in a Canadian research institution of any type, okay? And when you go through the process, you have to document very precisely what data you'll be collecting, from whom, and how you're going to protect both the data and the information about participants, right? You need to demonstrate what level of risk participants will go through, right? All of that business. So that's really important, all right? However, I want to put this asterisk there because I think it matters, which is that the REB process is designed under the presumption that your project is positivist in nature. Why? Because all research structures are designed under the presumption that people are positivist in nature, right? Positivism is the dominant paradigm in the traditional social sciences, and the fact that many of us are not positivists makes it very hard when the system still is built to assume that we're positivists, right? But you have to go through the process even if you're not a positivist. Different institutions will have different attitudes towards what a research ethics proposal will look like from somebody who's non-positivist or is using a method that is not suitable to this kind of logic. Oftentimes what you will have to do is be as clear as you can, and as things shift and change, make alterations on your ethics or document that to the REB. That's the biggest issue. But anyway, for those of you who are going to do human subjects projects for your proposal for your research plan, you are going to have to fill out a modified version of this form. I will send it to you. It's fairly straightforward. It matters that you have answers to all the questions and that they be justifiable. Okay, finally, or not finally, we haven't gotten to the Misc category yet. We're going to talk about data type, right? No matter what kind of data you're going to be collecting and analyzing, you need a strategy, right? Could be your set of interview questions, could be a search strategy for the archives, it could be a defined field site and information about it, right? You need to have some kind of plan for how you're going to go get the data. And then the type of plan you need varies based on whether this is quantitative or qualitative data, and then based on the type of quantitative and qualitative data, right? So usually what you need most for quantitative data, if you're conducting social science research, is you need a strategy for how to make information into numbers, right? Some numbers come that way, like income. Then you need a strategy for where you're going to get it and why you think that's a good source and all of that business. Some numbers are pretty easy. Some things are pretty easy to make into numbers. And the classic example here is a survey response, right? It is fairly easy to say the person responded A, B, C, or D and turn that into a 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? In your survey. You will then need to know about what type of variable it is, right? Whether it's a nominal, ordinal, or interval ratio variable. A nominal variable represents just a name that doesn't have any relationship in kind of strength to the others. Ordinal is something that can be rank ordered, but there isn't a precise difference, right? The difference between I like it a little and I like it a lot is ordinal. Interval ratio is something where there are discrete number chunks, right? So the difference between somebody making $50,000 a year, and the difference, and somebody making $90,000 a year is $400,000. And we can also say that the difference between somebody making 10,000 and 50,000 is $40,000, right? Sorry, ignore any math I got wrong in the following sentence, right? Right. There's also kind of what judgment calls are involved, right? So for instance, some of you might remember I talked about a project I ran where we coded tweets for the different themes that they were making jokes about, right? And what we found is we kind of had to go through and look and say, does this tweet contain a joke about gender? Does this tweet contain a joke about language? Does this tweet contain a joke about Islamic institutions, right? And that was a judgment call, right? And so we needed people with enough knowledge that they could like figure that out. And we needed people to be able to say, the reason I put it in this category is blah or blah or blah, right? If you're a positivist, you're very concerned with getting consistent results at that point. If you're a non-positivist, you also are probably, but you're doing quantitative work, you probably are also interested in consistent results because it doesn't help you do the quantitative analysis. But you're a little calmer about that possibility, right? But you do you have to think about that even if you're a non-positivist, right? For qualitative data, right, you have to figure out, first of all, how you're going to collect the data, how you're going to store it, and how you're going to analyze it, right? And this, can range from, I've had projects where my data is in like file folders, right? If I'm dealing with physical paper data. I've had data where it's spread out across notebooks, and that's in fact a huge problem because I will absolutely be the person who's like, wait, where do I have the notes from that interview? And I cannot find it. And so like, that's bad, right? Digital data, right? How are you going to organize it? And then like what will support the analysis of the data, right? So whatever it's going to be, you kind of have to go through these sets of processes in order to get the full information that you need. So yeah, so this is kind of part of the process, is kind of going through and thinking about how does the type of data I've got influence how I proceed with this. And then the kind of miscellaneous category here is really about the actual human process of collecting research, right? People do research. Even if people get computers to do a lot of the work for them, they're still the ones doing it, right? So you got to think about what you're going to need to be equipped with to do this. For lots of us, our data is available in specific places, right? So we have to go to those places to get that data, right? Whether it's an archive that holds the papers we need, or whether it is people who will be meeting at a certain place so we can go, we can go see them there, or whether it is like we're going to observe things in a time and place, right? How are you going to get there? Do you need permission to operate there? Who do you need permission from? Every time I'm conducting research somewhere else in a country other than Canada, I have to indicate whether I need permission from the government of that country or from institutions within that country to carry out the research. And the answer is usually no, but I know people who have needed to get approval to carry out their research in certain countries, right? And you need to document that. What do you need to function there, right? Can you get there? Can you get what you need, right? And then what are the costs, policies, and practices associated with it, right? If you're going to be interacting with people, are there things you need to do to be good at interacting with people, right? Remember that great article by Michael Orsini that we read a couple weeks ago about interacting with autistic people at the autistic conference, and the way people used different signaling methods to indicate being approached or not approached, right? If you walked up into a conference without being prepared for that sort of thing, that would be highly confusing to you and you wouldn't know what to do about it, right? Similarly, I work in places where men and women shaking hands is sometimes not a relevant practice, and yet sometimes is, right? So learning how to read the distinction between whether or not to hold out my hand to shake somebody's hand in a professional encounter, right? Is something I need to understand. And there's definitely been a couple of moments where I just super unconsciously was like, hi, I'm Dr. Emily, and got kind of one of these, right? And I was like, oh, hi, it's nice to meet you, right? Which is the alternative gesture. And then of course we got people who are like, oh, she's a foreigner, we can shake her hand, that's less problematic. Um, right. And that kind of understanding the norms in the place you are, right? And what that's going to be like is really important. Do you need to speak a language other than the one you speak, right? Do you need to speak it better than you already do, right? Is what you need enough of that language to kind of get around, but you'll actually be doing all your data collecting in your language, right? Which is something that lots of Anglophone researchers do, which is not always great. Or do you need to be fluent? What kind of fluency? How are you going to attain it, right? A corollary to that is, are there technical skills you need, right? To record the data, to process the data, statistical skills, right? How are you going to get them, right? Is there technology you need to do this work, right? Sometimes that's recording devices, sometimes that's specialized software, sometimes it's honestly like shoes and things like that, right? Like the stuff that will enable you to do the work you need to do is varied, right? And has to do with what the work you're going to do is, right? I do a lot of going and visiting people in villages and small towns as some of my work. And so I need clothes that are comfortable, professional, but not alienating, um, and hold up well to travel and wash well, because I come back from trips to the villages just covered in dust, right? And so it's like, okay, like I need to look like a professional and be able to have a good conversation here, but I also need to like be able to throw these clothes in the washing machine when I get back to my apartment at the end of the process, right? And so like, I have definitely gone shopping before fieldwork trips and said, okay, what will cover my arms fully, but I won't sweat to death in this because it's going to be August or similar processes, right? You need some of that stuff in order to be able to function in various field sites. And the other thing is, what human supports do you need to do this work, right? Do you need people to help you at a field site, right? Frequently these people are called fixers, which is not a great term, right? I prefer to think of people like that as collaborators and colleagues, and then I believe in including them in the work process, right? If people are going to be translating for you, right? Like, how are you going to find the translators? How are you going to include them in the research process? What is their goal? Do you need people to kind of keep your momentum going on your project, right? A lot of academics get a lot of benefit out of working with groups that can help them kind of keep momentum going, right? You have to share your writing every so often, things like that. Um, how is your friends and family going to cope? One of the things that's a major constraint on my research agenda is that I have a partner and two young kids, and my ability to disappear for months at a time is limited, even before the pandemic, when I cannot go anywhere at any time. So all of my research, I answered this for one project by conducting research that I could do where I lived, and other times by doing research that involves no travel. And sometimes when the research involves being elsewhere, it really involves short trips, right? Like 2 weeks, which is not a lot for an ethnographer to be immersed somewhere, right? And so, figuring out what you need as a person to be able to do research is really important, because all of us are people with bodies and minds and families and friends and social networks, and all of those really matter to what makes it possible for us to be researchers. And that sort of stuff is also what is the important stuff about research, right? Research is interesting to me because people do it, not because machines do it. It's interesting because it's part of the process of human meaning making, and how we invest in the world around us. And that might be the most interpretivist thing I've said to you in the follow in the previous couple months. So with that, this is what I wanted to share with you guys about um, how research works and kind of how you develop a research plan. We will talk more in class about all of this business, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Okay, bye.